And as Doubra stood outside in the hot afternoon sun, one hand on her belly, feeling her baby kick for the very first time, her father, Mr. Patrick, pointed at her and shouted aggressively, "You are no longer welcome in this house." Her mother's voice followed sharply, "You are a disgrace to us." The door slammed violently. Doubra flinched. Then she began knocking, soft at first, then desperately, as tears streamed down her face and soaked her clothes. "Neighbours, please help me!" she screamed on top of her voice, but no one came to help her. What will happen to Doubra now that her own parents have rejected her? Sit back as we unveil this shocking story of rejection, survival, and unbelievable destiny. Doubra was the kind of girl people pointed to when they wanted to show their children what good character looked like. She was 22 years old, slender and soft-spoken, with eyes that were always slightly too gentle for the world around her. She swept the compound before her parents woke up. She fetched water before school. She returned home before dark. She greeted every elder with both hands and a bent knee. She had never given her parents a single reason to be ashamed of her, not once, not in 22 years, until the day she did. It happened quietly, the way most life-changing things do. There was a young man named Emeka, who had come from the city to stay with his uncle 3 streets away. He was charming and well-dressed, with smooth words and a smile that made girls forget everything their mothers had told them. He told Doubra she was different. He told her she was special. He told her he loved her. She believed him because she had been raised to believe that people generally meant what they said. They were together for 7 months before Doubra discovered she was pregnant. And when she told Emeka, with trembling hands and a voice barely above a whisper, he laughed a short, cold laugh, and then he was gone. Gone from the street, gone from the town, gone from her life as completely as if he had never existed. Doubra was left alone with a growing belly and a secret that could not be hidden for long. Her father, Mr. Patrick, was not a cruel man in the ordinary sense of the word. He was a man who had built his whole life around his reputation. He was a deacon in the church. He was the chairman of the Community Development Council. He was the man people called when they had disputes, because he was known to be fair and upright. His house was clean, his name was clean, and for a man like him, a pregnant, unmarried daughter was not just a personal problem, it was a public disaster. When Doubra finally told him, because her belly had grown too large to explain away with loose clothing and strategic positioning, he sat very still for a long time. He did not shout immediately. He stared at the wall. And then he turned to look at his daughter as if she had transformed into something he did not recognize. "Who is responsible?" he asked. She told him about Emeka. She told him Emeka was gone. She told him she was sorry. Mr. Patrick stood up, and Doubra could see something close in his eyes. Not rage exactly, but the death of something. The death of the version of his daughter he had constructed in his mind. Her mother, Mrs. Patrick, sat at the edge of the room with both hands over her mouth. She was a soft woman, the kind who watered her husband's decisions like a garden and watched them grow regardless of what she privately felt. She loved Doubra fiercely and privately and uselessly. She loved her the way people love things they are not brave enough to fight for. The family meeting lasted one evening. The relatives came and went. Words were spoken, judgments were made, and at the end of it all, Mr. Patrick delivered his verdict the way he delivered all his verdicts, with the certainty of a man who believed he was always right. "You will leave this house," he said. "I cannot have what you have done living under my roof," Doubra begged. She held her mother's hands and looked into her eyes and searched for the woman who used to plait her hair and sing her to sleep. She found her, she could see her in there, somewhere behind the fear and the shame, but her mother could not reach back. "Your father has spoken," Mrs. Patrick said softly, and she turned away. The next morning was the afternoon moment that would mark Doubra's life forever. She stood outside in the punishing sun, one hand resting on her belly, and felt her baby kick for the very first time. A tiny, fragile movement, like a secret the baby was sharing with her alone. And in that same breath, the door opened and her father pointed at her with a trembling finger and told her she was no longer welcome. She knocked, she begged, she wept until her throat was raw. Nobody opened the door. That first night was the hardest night of Doubra's life, and it would be followed by many hard nights, so that is not a small thing to say. She walked away from her father's gate with nothing but a small bag her mother had quietly pushed out through the kitchen window before anyone was watching. Inside the bag was one change of clothing, a small amount of money that could not have been more than enough for 3 days, a photograph of Doubra as a child with her mother, and a Bible, no note. Just those things, pressed into a bag and delivered through a window in secret, because love without courage is still love, it just cannot save anyone. Doubra did not know where to go. She walked slowly, her belly heavy, her feet aching, her eyes still wet. She walked past the church where her father was a deacon. She walked past the school where her younger relatives attended. She walked past the market where people knew her face and her name. She kept her head low. She could not go to a neighbour. The neighbours would tell her father and then report the matter to the community council. She could not go to her relatives. They had been at the meeting and had sided with her father. She could not go to her friends. Most of them had quietly stepped back when the news of her pregnancy spread, as if her situation were contagious. By the time evening fell, Doubra had found herself at the edge of the market, near the cluster of abandoned stalls where sellers went after closing. She sat under a stall canopy, with her bag in her lap, talking softly to her unborn child. "I don't know what is going to happen to us," she whispered, "but I know that you are real, and as long as you are real, I will not give up." The baby kicked again. As if in response, Doubra placed both hands on her belly and held on. It was an old woman who found her that night. She came shuffling through the market with a lantern and a bundle of dried leaves she had been gathering, and she nearly tripped over Doubra's outstretched legs before she saw her. The old woman's name was Mama Rose, and she was the kind of person whose life had written wisdom across her face in deep, patient lines. She was not rich, she was not well connected, she had no powerful friends, and no large house. But she had something that was rarer in that moment than any of those things. She had a heart that was not afraid to feel someone else's pain. "Why are you sitting here in the dark?" Mama Rose asked, holding the lantern closer. Doubra opened her mouth to explain, and instead she simply began to cry. Mama Rose listened to the whole story without interruption. She listened the way very few people listen, not preparing her response while Doubra spoke, but actually receiving every word. When Doubra finished, the old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come, You will sleep in my house tonight. Mama Rose's house was a single-room structure with a low roof and a curtain instead of a door to the sleeping area. There was a small kerosene stove, a mat on the floor, and a shelf with a few ceramic plates. It was humble to the point of poverty, but there was warmth in it, the kind of warmth that comes not from comfort, but from the person who inhabits a space. That night, lying on the mat with a thin wrapper over her belly, Doubra made a decision. Not a dramatic decision, not the kind you announce to anyone, a quiet one, the kind that forms in the dark and becomes the foundation everything else is built on. She decided she would not die. She decided she would not beg. She decided she would build something for herself and for this child who was already kicking and fighting inside her. She did not know yet what that something would be, but she decided firmly and finally that whatever the world thought of her, she was not finished. In the weeks that followed, Doubra learned things about survival that she never could have learned any other way. She learned that hunger is loudest at night. She learned that pregnancy and poverty together create a particular kind of suffering that people look at and quickly look away from. She learned that the same neighbours who had praised her good character for years could pretend not to see her when she passed on the street. She learned that dignity costs nothing, but that the world will charge you for it anyway. She started with the only thing she had, her willingness to work. In the early mornings, before the sun climbed too high for her swollen feet, she walked to the homes of families who needed laundry done and offered her services for a small fee. Some accepted. Many did not. Some saw her pregnancy and made unkind remarks. A woman once told her she should have thought about this before she went and opened her legs. Doubra said nothing. She smiled, turned, and went to the next house. She washed clothes. She fetched water. She swept compounds for those who needed it. She ran small errands. With whatever money she gathered, she gave some to Mama Rose for food and kept the rest in a small tin she hid under the mat. Every coin she saved felt like a small act of defiance against the world that had decided she was finished. People mocked her. They would see her walking to a client's house, belly round and visible, and they would say things sometimes under their breath and sometimes openly about how she had brought shame on herself, how she had no one to blame, how her parents were right to throw her out. Some said it with cruelty. Some said it with a self-righteous satisfaction that felt even worse than cruelty. Doubra took every word and converted it into fuel. She could not stop people from talking, but she could control what she did after they talked. Mama Rose watched all of this and said nothing unnecessary. She cooked for Doubra when there was food. She sat with her in the evenings and told her stories, old stories, the kind that had been passed down through generations, about women who had fallen and risen and fallen again and still managed to leave something standing. On one of those evenings, Mama Rose looked at Doubra and said something that stayed with her for the rest of her life. "Pain is not the end of a story," the old woman said. "Sometimes it is the beginning." Doubra held those words carefully. She wrote them in the small notebook she kept near her Bible. She read them on the mornings when getting up felt impossible. Then the baby came. Doubra went into labour in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, 7.5 months after she had been thrown out of her parents' house. Mama Rose was there. A neighbour woman with some midwifery experience was called. There was no hospital. Doubra had not saved enough for hospital fees, and she had been too proud and too frightened to tell anyone how serious the situation was becoming. The birth was long and difficult. There were moments in the night when Doubra clenched Mama Rose's hand so tightly, the old woman later joked that she thought her fingers might break. There were moments when Doubra lost herself to the pain completely, when the line between her body and the darkness around her became blurred and uncertain. But then the baby cried. A small, fierce, outraged cry, the cry of a person who had just arrived somewhere and was immediately making their presence known. Doubra, exhausted and soaked and trembling, heard that cry and began to weep, not from sadness, from something much larger than sadness, from relief and from recognition, and from a love so overwhelming it felt like a physical force. "It is a girl," the neighbour woman said. Doubra held her daughter and looked at her face for a long time. Small and wrinkled and perfect, eyes tightly shut, fists clenched, as if ready for a fight. "Miracle," Doubra said. "Your name is Miracle." Everyone who heard the name raised an eyebrow. A child born in poverty to a rejected young woman with no husband and no family, what kind of name was Miracle? It seemed like cruelty, like naming something impossible after something impossible. But Doubra was not naming her daughter after what had already happened. She was naming her after what was going to happen. The first 3 months after Miracle's birth were the most terrifying of Doubra's life. Miracle fell sick when she was barely 6 weeks old, a chest infection that made her tiny body shudder with every breath. Doubra carried her to a clinic and was told she needed medication and a week of monitoring. She did not have the money. She went back to the market area and washed clothes and ran errands with Miracle tied to her back. She went faster than she should have. She pushed harder than she should have. She took every job she could find, no matter how small, no matter how demeaning. She sometimes worked until her hands were so sore she could barely close them. She raised the money for the medication in 4 days. It was during those 4 days that something hardened in Doubra, not her heart, which stayed soft, but her will. Something in her will became iron. She discovered something about herself that her comfortable life inside her parents' house had never given her cause to discover. She was not someone who broke easily. She was not someone who could be undone. There were nights she sat with Miracle, sleeping against her chest, and wrote letters to her parents, long letters, full of what she was experiencing, what she was learning, what she wished they could see. She never sent a single one. She didn't write them to send. She wrote them because writing was the only way she could process everything that was happening to her without losing her mind. In those letters, she was not bitter. She was honest. She wrote, "Father, I made a mistake, but your decision to throw me out was also a mistake. And one day, I believe we will both understand that." She sealed each letter and put it in the tin beside her savings. And then she went back to work. When Miracle was 8 months old, Doubra began selling food. It was Mama Rose's idea, practically speaking, but Doubra made it her own. She started with a modest pot of pepper soup and a tray of small chops that she prepared in Mama Rose's kitchen from 4 in the morning and carried to the market by 7. Miracle slept strapped to her back in a wrapper, perfectly still, except for the soft rise and fall of her small chest. The first day, Doubra sold half her stock before noon and went home with more money than she had made in 3 days of laundry work. She stood in Mama Rose's kitchen that evening and counted the money 3 times because she could not quite believe it. The second day, she made more. But success, she quickly learned, was its own kind of battlefield. Within 2 weeks of establishing a spot in the market, she was chased away from her location by a group of older traders who told her she was taking customers from them. She moved to another section. She was chased from there too. She found a corner near the entrance of the market, a position nobody else wanted because of the dust and the noise from the road. She cleaned it herself and set up there, and decided that if this was the only ground she was given, then she would turn it into her own. There were customers who ate her food and then claimed they had no money, shrugging and walking away before she could respond. There were people who deliberately negotiated her price down to almost nothing because they knew she had a baby and needed every sale. There were mornings when the ingredients cost more than she made, and she went home with nothing except the exhaustion. She did not stop. She became known gradually for 2 things: the quality of her food and the unusual way she conducted herself. She did not argue with difficult customers. She did not engage in the market gossip and quarrels that consumed much of the day. She arrived early and left late. She was patient with elderly customers and gentle with children who came to buy on behalf of their mothers. She kept meticulous track of what she spent and what she earned, writing everything in her notebook in a careful, deliberate hand. It was this reputation of a young woman who worked without complaint and dealt with everyone fairly that eventually caught the attention of a woman named Mrs. Agbede. Mrs. Agbede was a businesswoman who supplied goods to stores and restaurants across 3 towns. She was sharp-eyed and no-nonsense and had built her own success from very little, and she recognized something in Doubra the moment she stopped at her food stall one Thursday morning. She ate, she watched, she ate again. Then she said, "You come and see me tomorrow. I have a proposition." Doubra spent the entire night convincing herself to go. She knew nothing about this woman except that she was well dressed and spoke with authority. She thought about all the ways this could be a trick. She thought about all the ways this could be an opportunity. She prayed. She spoke softly to Miracle, who was asleep and therefore a patient listener. And in the morning, she left Miracle with Mama Rose and went to find Mrs. Agbede. The proposition was straightforward. Mrs. Agbede would loan Doubra the money to expand her business more stock, a proper stall space she would pay for legitimately, equipment she needed. In return, Doubra would repay the loan from her profits over 12 months, with no interest. "Why?" Doubra asked. It was the first question she asked before any practical question about the money. "Why would you do this?" Mrs. Agbede looked at her steadily. "Because I sat where you are sitting once," she said. "Not exactly the same chair, but close enough." Doubra accepted. What followed was not an overnight transformation. It was daily, grinding, determined growth. It was months of waking before the sun and sleeping after midnight. It was learning how to source better ingredients. It was learning how to price things properly. It was learning how to manage the money, how to reinvest, how to plan. It was Miracle growing on her back from a baby into a toddler, watching her mother work with serious, observant eyes. It was Mama Rose, never asking for more than she needed, feeding Doubra's soul with stories and wisdom on the evenings when everything felt too heavy. It was slow, it was painful, it was real, and it was working. By the time Miracle was 4 years old, Doubra had repaid Mrs. Agbaday in full, expanded her stall into a proper food kiosk, and was employing 2 young women from the market to help her. By the time Miracle was 7, Doubra had moved them both out of Mama Rose's single room and into a small but clean and real house, with a proper door and a kitchen and a bedroom for Miracle all her own. On the day they moved in, Doubra stood in the empty sitting room and turned around slowly, looking at all 4 walls. She thought about the compound she had grown up in, the good compound with the swept floors and the straight fence and the father's name on a plaque by the gate. She thought about the kitchen window her mother had pushed a bag through in secret, because love without courage is still love. She thought about the tin where she had kept her letters and her savings all those years ago. She allowed herself 1 minute of remembering. Then she began to unpack. There is a kind of justice in this world that does not announce itself. It does not come with drums or with a crowd. It comes quietly, the way water comes into a house, seeping in through the smallest cracks, patient and unstoppable. While Doubra worked and built and raised her daughter and refused to become bitter, her parents were living their comfortable life in the house with the plaque by the gate. For the first year after they threw her out, nothing changed for them. Her father continued as deacon, her mother continued her women's meetings, the house stayed clean, the name stayed clean, but then the cracks began. Mr. Patrick lost his job not suddenly, but through a gradual restructuring at the government department where he had worked for 21 years. He was told he was too senior to be retrained and too old to be kept. He was given a small severance and sent home. For a man who had built his identity around his authority and his position, losing his job was not just a financial blow, it was an identity crisis that hollowed him out slowly, week by week. He invested the severance money in a business his brother-in-law convinced him was a good opportunity. The business failed within 8 months. The money was gone. Then the house. They had taken a loan against the house to fund a ceremony, a naming ceremony for a grandchild from another family member, something Mr. Patrick had insisted on doing lavishly because of what people would say if he did not. When the loan repayment became impossible after his income disappeared, the bank began proceedings. Within 2 years of losing his job, Mr. Patrick and his wife moved out of the house they had lived in for 30 years. They moved into a small room in a relative's house. The relative was not unkind, but the arrangement was humiliating for a man who had been the one others came to for help. Then Mr. Patrick's health began to fail. First it was his blood pressure, then his knees, then something the doctors spoke about seriously in quiet voices that frightened Mrs. Patrick deeply. He needed treatment he could not afford. He needed care that nobody around him was willing or able to provide indefinitely. The friends who had eaten at his table and praised his name and attended his ceremonies, they were scarce when he needed them. People who had borrowed money from him in better years suddenly could not be reached. The community that had looked up to him moved on, as communities do, to whoever was currently standing on the highest ground. Mrs. Patrick began to cry at night when she thought her husband was sleeping. He was not sleeping. He was also lying awake in the dark, and the thing he saw most clearly in that darkness was the face of his daughter, the girl he had pointed at, the girl he had called a disgrace, the girl he had locked outside with a pregnant belly in the afternoon sun, while she knocked, and nobody opened the door. He did not speak about this, not to his wife, not to anyone, but it lived in him, the memory of that knocking. It lived in him the way guilt lives, not as a thought exactly, but as a physical weight, something that pressed on his chest in the night and made it harder to breathe. Mrs. Patrick, for her part, had thought about her daughter every single day since that afternoon. She had heard through the distant channels of community gossip that still found its way to her, even in her changed circumstances, that Doubra was alive, that she had a daughter, that she was managing somehow. This information was always vague and always second-hand. She did not know the details of what her daughter had been through. She only knew that Doubra was alive, and that this was both a relief and a reproach, because every day Doubra was alive was another day that bore witness to what they had done. The family discussed several times whether they should try to reach Doubra. Mr. Patrick always silenced the conversation. He was not ready. He was too proud, still, even in poverty, to be the one who reached out first. His pride had cost him his daughter, and his pride was still costing him, every day, compound interest on the original debt. It would take desperation to move him, and desperation eventually came. Doubra was 31 years old when she opened her second business. It was not a food stall anymore. It was a proper catering and supply company registered with a name and a sign and a business account. She supplied events, hotels, and restaurants across the region. She had 8 full-time employees and a small fleet of delivery vehicles. She had built this from a tray of small chops carried to a dusty market corner on a morning when her baby was asleep against her back. Miracle was 9 by now, and she was everything Doubra had named her to be. She was bright and focused, the kind of child who asked questions that adults found startling in their precision. She knew, in the way that children raised in honest households know things, that her mother had built everything they had from nothing. She had been told the story, not the full story, not yet, but enough. She knew there had been hard times. She knew her mother had worked for every single thing. This knowledge lived in Miracle, not as sadness, but as determination. She helped without being asked. She studied without being pushed. She hugged her mother unexpectedly at random moments, as if she could feel the weight her mother sometimes carried and was trying to distribute it more evenly. Mama Rose had grown old and frail, and Doubra had quietly moved her into the spare room of her new house, where she could be cared for and warm and never again carry bundles of dried leaves through a dark market at night. Mama Rose accepted this arrangement with her characteristic lack of fuss, and spent her days sitting in the small garden Doubra had planted and watching Miracle do her homework, and occasionally offering the child unsolicited pieces of wisdom that Miracle received with solemn attention. The day the Patrick family came to Doubra's company office began like any other day. A member of Doubra's staff, a young receptionist named Chidinma, came to tell her that 2 elderly people had arrived asking to speak with whoever was in charge of employment. They had heard, they said, that the company sometimes hired older workers for certain positions, and they needed work badly. Their circumstances, as Chidinma described them, were clearly difficult. The woman looked like she had been crying recently. The man walked with a cane and moved like someone who was in pain. "Ask them to wait," Doubra said. "I will come out in a few minutes." She was not expecting what she was about to walk into. She was thinking about a contract she needed to finalize before noon. She collected her folder, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the reception area. She stopped in the doorway. The two people sitting in the reception chairs, looking small and reduced, and uncertain people who did not look like they belonged in their own skin anymore, were her father and her mother. Mr. Patrick had aged in the way that unhappy men age faster than time itself. His face, which she remembered as firm and imposing, had hollowed. His shoulders, which had once been set with the authority of a man accustomed to making pronouncements, were curved inward. He held his cane in both hands, like a man gripping something he was not sure would hold him. Mrs. Patrick sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the floor. She had not yet seen Doubra in the doorway. Doubra stood very still. The receptionist, Chidinma, said, "Ma, this is the owner." And then Mrs. Patrick looked up. The sound she made was not a word. It was a small, broken sound, the kind that happens when a person's body responds before their mind catches up. She raised her hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled immediately. Mr. Patrick turned to look. He saw his daughter, and all the pride that had survived poverty, sickness, humiliation, and the slow collapse of everything he had built, all of it collapsed in that moment. His face crumpled, his jaw worked but produced no sound. His eyes, which Doubra remembered as hard and certain, were wet. The reception area was quiet. Chidinma, uncertain and instinctively sensing that something enormous was happening in the room, slipped out silently. Doubra walked toward her parents. She moved slowly, not because she was reluctant, but because her legs were not entirely certain how to carry her. 1,000 things were happening inside her at once. She was 22 again, standing outside in the sun, feeling the first kick of her child against her palm while the door slammed. She was 17, watching her mother plait her hair. She was 23, lying on a mat and making a quiet decision in the dark. She was the girl who had knocked and not been answered, and she was also the woman who had built the house that everyone was now sitting inside. She stopped in front of them. Mr. Patrick opened his mouth. He tried to say something and failed. He tried again. "Doubra," he said finally, and then, "I am sorry." These were perhaps the hardest 3 words he had ever spoken, because they were true, and because they cost him everything he had left of his former self to say them. His voice broke on the last one. Mrs. Patrick was crying fully now, tears running silently without performance. And then Miracle appeared curious, having heard the particular quality of silence from the hallway near Doubra's office, where she had been waiting to be picked up after school. She walked into the reception area with her school bag over her shoulder and her expression carrying the careful assessment of a child who understands that adults are sometimes having important moments. She looked at the 2 old people. She looked at her mother's face. She asked the question with the directness of a child who had been raised to be honest. "Ma'am, who are these people?" Doubra looked at her daughter. Then she looked at her parents, at her father's cane, her mother's folded hands, the ruin of pride and the reality of age, and the irreversible passage of all those years. She said, "They are my parents." And this is where my story began. What happened next was not a scene of dramatic reconciliation. It was quieter than that, truer than that. Doubra led her parents into her office and gave them chairs. She asked Chidinma to bring water and tea. She sat across from the people who had thrown her out and looked at them, really looked at them, not with the eyes of the abandoned girl, but with the eyes of a woman who had learned through years of hard living that people are complicated and pain makes everyone smaller than they want to be. She listened to her father speak. He spoke slowly, with long pauses, as if each sentence was expensive. He told her about the job, the money, the house. He told her about the sickness, the diagnosis the doctors had given him 3 months ago, the treatment that cost more than they could manage, the relatives who had grown distant, the friends who had disappeared. He told her about the nights he lay awake. He did not say specifically what he thought about in those nights, but he did not need to. The way he looked at her when he said it told her everything. Her mother said very little during all of this. But at one point she reached forward and took Doubra's hand in both of hers, and she held it without speaking, and that wordless holding said more than anything she could have managed to articulate. When her father finished, Doubra was quiet for a moment. She thought about all the letters she had written and never sent, sealed in a tin that she still kept, not out of bitterness, but because those letters were the record of who she had been and how she had survived. She thought about Mama Rose saying that pain is not the end of a story. She thought about the first kick she had felt, outside in the sun, the moment everything broke open and began. She said, "I don't know how to pretend that what happened didn't happen. I can't do that. But I also don't want to carry it forever." She paused. "I was thrown out with nothing, and I built something. I built it for Miracle, and for myself, and also for the person I wanted to become. I didn't want to become someone who breaks, and I didn't want to become someone who holds on to things that will only keep breaking me." She looked at her father. "I forgive you, Father, not because what you did was right, but because I refuse to let it have the last word." Mr. Patrick bowed his head. His shoulders shook once, silently. "And I forgive you, Mother," Doubra said more gently, because she understood her mother differently, understood the particular courage it takes to exist in the shadow of a strong-willed man, and the particular cowardice it produces over time. "I know you loved me." Her mother's grip on her hand tightened. Miracle sat in the corner of the office. Throughout all of this, she was 9 years old, and she understood more than most adults would have expected her to. She watched her mother with the attentive quiet she always brought to important moments. At the end, when the adults had said what they needed to say, she got up and walked to the old man with the cane and stood in front of him. "I am Miracle," she said, formally, solemnly, the way Doubra had taught her to introduce herself to elders. Mr. Patrick looked at his granddaughter for a long moment. Then he placed his hand gently on her head. "Yes," he said, "you are." In the months that followed, Doubra arranged for her father's medical treatment. She paid for it quietly, without announcement, without making her parents feel the weight of the charity more than they already felt it. She found them a clean, small apartment, close enough to her own home that her mother could visit Miracle after school, and far enough to give everyone the space that new and tender relationships require. Her father's health improved gradually. He was not the same man he had been, but few people are. After a great fall, He was quieter now, more careful. He sat in the garden of his new apartment on mornings and seemed to be processing something that had no end. One day, he asked Doubra if he could read the letters she had written and never sent. She thought about this for several days before she answered. Then she brought the tin and gave it to him and let him read every letter, alone in the garden. She did not watch. She did not want to see his face while he read them. When he returned the tin, he said only, "I am sorry for every word you wrote that should not have needed writing." And Doubra took the tin and put it away, and neither of them spoke of the letters again. Some things, once acknowledged, do not need to be revisited. Mrs. Patrick became, slowly and carefully, a presence in Miracle's life. She taught her granddaughter the recipe for her pepper soup, the real one, with the ingredients in the right order and the heat managed correctly. Miracle received this information with the same solemn attention she brought to everything. She told her grandmother that her mother's pepper soup was very good, but that this version was different. "Better?" her grandmother asked. Miracle considered this seriously. "Different," she repeated, diplomatically. Mrs. Patrick laughed for the first time in what felt like years. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that reminds you what you had forgotten you were capable of. Mama Rose lived to see all of this. She sat in Doubra's garden on the day that Doubra's parents came to visit for the first time, a formal visit, arranged and slightly stiff and full of things that nobody quite knew how to say, and she watched from her chair with a small, private smile that suggested she had always known this day would come and was simply pleased to be present for it. Doubra came and sat beside her at the end of the day, when her parents had left, and Miracle was inside doing her homework, and the garden was quiet in the evening light. "You were right," Doubra said. "I am always right," Mama Rose said. "That is the advantage of being old and having paid for wisdom with actual suffering." She paused. "Which part was I right about?" "Pain not being the end," Doubra said. Mama Rose nodded. She looked at the garden, at the plants Doubra had grown, at the clean ground, at the house behind them with its proper walls and its proper door and the light coming through the windows. "The beginning," she said quietly. "I told you, the beginning. There is a sign now at the entrance of Doubra's company. It reads simply, 'Miracle Supplies and Catering Est,' with nothing. Built with everything. People ask her sometimes what the story behind the name is. She always smiles when they ask. It is a long story, she says. It begins with a door that was closed, and it ends here. And here is where we leave her, standing in the place she built, surrounded by the people she has loved and been loved by, carrying the full weight of everything that happened to her and wearing it not as a wound but as a testimony, because God sees every tear that falls in private. He hears every knock that goes unanswered. He records every night of hunger, every mocking word, every moment of choosing to continue when there is every reason to stop. And in his time, not always fast, not always in the way we expect, he opens doors that no one can shut. Doubra was rejected. She was discarded. She was told by the people who should have known her best that she was not worth keeping. And she became the answer to the very prayer her parents would one day cry out in desperation. Never despise the struggling person beside you. Never be too proud to acknowledge your mistakes. Never close a door on someone simply because you cannot see what they are about to become. The person you abandon today may be the one who carries you tomorrow. And the child they said was a mistake, she became the miracle. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our next powerful story. We bring you real-life stories of struggle, survival, and triumph that will inspire you, move you, and remind you of the strength within you. Coming up next, we have another incredible story that will leave you speechless. You won't want to miss it. Like this video, drop a comment below and tell us what part of Doubra's journey moved you the most. Share your thoughts. We read every single comment. See you in the next video. God bless you. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications.